Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I regard it an honor to have been asked to address this audience. So thank you for having me. As you know, I preside over the Household Committee of the Deutsche Bundestag. Annually, we negotiate the federal budget. And since this budget happens to be, the largest of any private and public institution in Germany, it is approximately 400 billion euros large, you can imagine that many of the thousands of individual budget positions are contested and often very fiercely debated. And it's really thousands of them. Therefore, believe me that having to moderate this committee is a difficult diplomatic task, even though I'm not a diplomat myself. This is why I have chosen Theodore Roosevelt's famous quote as my headline today. So, unless you have heard it before, "Speak softly and carry a big stick" is a 100-year-old quote from Theodore Roosevelt. And, I thought it describes what diplomacy can achieve and how it can be achieved, especially in difficult situations. Speaking softly, of course, is not always possible, but it is important. You all know that acting from a position of power makes speaking softly a lot easier. Honestly, it is mainly my colleagues from the big coalition, from those fractions who can afford to speak softly and diplomatically because they have the overwhelming majority, both in the parliament and in my committee. There are, however, more limitations to what diplomacy can do, way beyond budget negotiations. Let me therefore talk more generically about diplomacy and its importance in democratic processes in general. And I know that democracy is a main field of research for ICD as well. We have heard Per Stenbeck this morning, Foreign Minister of Finland, and I think tomorrow you're going to hear Brian Cohen, Irish Prime Minister, former Irish Prime Minister, on the same topic. And of course, I know that Yves Leterme is very active here and with IDEA International, and he has done, of course, a lot of work re the state of democracy worldwide and its resiliency. Let us start with your very definition, ICD's definition of what cultural diplomacy is. And I quote now from your very website: "It is the exchange of ideas, values, culture, identity in order to strengthen cultural cooperation with the ultimate goal of contributing to global peace and stability." All this goes without saying. Every civilized and culturally educated person can certainly subscribe to these goals, but how about practice? In practice, even the best of diplomacy and rhetoric cannot resolve all issues arising between groups of people. Especially in negotiation situations, and almost all serious communication somehow is a negotiation situation, material concessions are usually necessary to come to terms with each other. Peace and stability between groups in an environment with scarce resources, which we almost always have, are the result of compromise. Speaking softly, diplomacy, mutual cultural understanding are all very important techniques, but ultimately soft power and rhetoric in politics cannot substitute substantial concessions. In addition, never must cause and effect be confused. As an example, let us take a text from today's conference. This is your conference brochure. And I quote again: "The international community today is being challenged by new forms of social unrest, which are creating doubts in an erosion of the long-last structure of society as had existed so far." Well, I claim that this unrest, to quite some extent, is no cause of the erosion of stability, but an effect. An effect of a worldwide policy towards abandonment of borders people were never allowed to vote on, at least not freely democratically in the original sense of the word. One can carry everything too far, including good ideas like open borders, which is a very important idea. Free trade is extremely important for the worldwide wealth. But open borders are a different thing than abolished borders. Open borders are completely different thing than abolished borders. People were never allowed to vote on border abolishment. Hence today's protests in so many countries, and hence we see what is falsely called social unrest. The most obvious example was the Brexit vote of the British people, which ultimately was a form of protest of the British, not only about unelected EU supranationalism, but against the abolishment of borders, especially since 2015 in continental Europe. Today, 2018, even more nation states and their people protest implicitly against the actions of poorly democratically legitimized supranational agents voting on their behalf for the abolishment of borders and therefore nation states and national cultures. Latest example is, of course, the so-called Global Compact on Migration, signed this very week in Marrakesh. We just heard the Bulgarian colleague speaking before me on this topic, which, well, everybody seems to really energize, and everybody wants to talk about that. Here we have a very clear restriction of what diplomacy, including cultural diplomacy, can do. People feel some sort of danger, and they have, I believe, good reason to do so, but we can talk about that. In order to develop, any high culture needs a protected zone for a long time. This zone traditionally has been the nation state. And it's agreed upon natural borders. As in the old US saying from, well, frontier times, some 200 years ago or 300 years ago, good fences make for good neighbors. No cultural diplomacy will be able to stop resistance against undemocratic and even unnatural political decisions like those taken in 2015 or 2018. Good cultural diplomats must communicate with the people in a true two-way dialogue where truths, including unwelcome truths, must be allowed to be articulated, even in an undiplomatic and politically incorrect manner. Good cultural diplomats, first and foremost, have to be ambassadors of the people. And I would add, they therefore have to be advocates of direct democracy. I know that not everybody likes direct democracy. I've heard some discussions you have had within this group in the past. But I have a sympathy towards direct democracy because there's no need for populism in parliaments if the populace, the Greek or Latin word for people, has a direct vote. Giving people a voice is good. Give them a vote is better, and an unfiltered vote is best. Direct democracy is the best tool against frustration of the masses with politics and their leaders. Truth is, of course, more important than diplomatic politeness, even though it is, of course, best to convey truth politely. This is actually the really high art. Former German President Theodor Heuss, a liberal Democrat, has once said, "The Occidental culture and civilization has come down to our Europe from three hills. From the Acropolis, of course, this was the Attic idea of democracy, from Golgotha, Christianity and our Christian Jewish heritage, and from the capital, which is the Res Publica, or the rule of law." That's what he said more than 50 years ago. And in that respect, culture, faith, and democracy were interwoven always from the very beginning of Western civilization, or what we call Western civilization. Nevertheless, it took more than 2,000 years from Solon, the Greek inventor of the original or initial concept of democracy, to the breakthrough of the concept in the 18th and especially in the 19th century, with the rise of a self-confident and increasingly wealthy bourgeoisie, which led to the revolutionary concept of nation states with power segregation in parliaments within constitutional monarchies. Through to the 20th century when, well, democracy was finalized with women's right to vote, of course, when it was established almost everywhere. One important democratic revolution here in Germany was the one from what we call the Paulskirche in 1848, which later on in 1871 led to constitutional, and after 1918, and especially after 1945, to a full democracy here in this country. This revolution of 1848 was both a liberal and a national revolution, directed against absolute monarchs as well as against later times totalitarians from left to right. Democracy needs to continually fight for its right to exist. It must always be defended, and sometimes it even took undemocratic means to bring it into and keep it in existence. The nation state and borders were absolute preconditions for democracies. A former constitutional judge here in Germany once said, "Democracies live from preconditions they cannot bring about themselves." What he meant, and I believe rightfully so, is the historical and somewhat logical fact that democracy was not brought to us by democratic means. I mean, how could it have been brought to us by democratic means? It had to be invented first in a non-democratic environment. We can trace back the often militant struggles for democratic power sharing through medieval times and even back to the antique. Even then, democracy was only implemented against resistance and of course only for the elites, especially initially at the times in the antique. Ultimately, it was not implemented in today's modern form anywhere before the invention of strong nation states. To this very day, there is no example, and I repeat that, there is no example of a functioning democracy beyond national borders. The European Parliament, for example, is no parliament with real power. It sees itself as supranational, and of course it is supranational, but it cannot be a constitutional body because the EU is no nation state and must not become one. This is German constitutional law, and it is the same in many countries of the EU. In France, nobody even thinks of the EU becoming a nation state, and the British were so horrified of the idea of losing even more of its sovereign national rights that they preferred to leave the EU completely. Democracies need the nurturing room, the protected zone of the nation state first. Regarding culture, well, it's not quite so easy to say, but high cultures too often depended on this very protection. No high culture can exist in times and zones of turmoil or with dysfunctional borders. There is hardly any example where in times of turmoil high cultures came into existence. Democracy and culture are fragile concepts which need protection and long time frames to develop. It is therefore important for diplomats and politicians not to forget this. The tarnish of civilization is unfortunately very thin, and it must not be endangered with concepts that are completely untested in history, such as the establishment of supra-states beyond traditionally relatively homogeneous areas, such as the Occident, or Asia, or Islamic Arabia, or Africa. The very idea of multiculturalism is very young in historical terms. Up until 100 years ago, international trade was hardly measurable. It was only, and I'm an economist, I know those graphs. It was only after 1970 that exchange of goods and cheap mass communication really became mass markets and international travel affordable to the people. Multiculturalism needs trust in each other beyond national borders. And, well, you're the best example here. You talk to each other beyond national borders. But it is hard to implement without very cheap oil and therefore very cheap international travel. It's trivial, but it's true. And this was not the case up until 40, 50 years ago. That's why those international, supranational ideas are, well, pretty young. They are a result of the 20th century. Of course, there were thinkers, supranational thinkers before the 20th century, but those were really basically theorists, theoretical thinkers. And even then, well, the language barrier must not be underestimated. Whilst elites of respective nations, and I believe you are all language elites, tend to communicate easily with each other, the same does not apply to the masses. They stick to their homeland ideologically, and I believe this to be natural. They therefore have a right for their respective nationally unique cultures. Please bear these hard physical, economic, mass psychological, and historical facts in mind when practicing cultural diplomacy. The following thesis from your own website is ambitious. I'm not saying it is wrong, but it isn't ideal and it has its restriction. Let me quote first your website. Cultural diplomacy has existed as a practice for centuries. Explorers, travelers, traders, teachers, and artists can all be considered living examples of informal ambassadors or early cultural diplomats. Well, that's perfectly true, but it is a very small ridge we're walking on here, because the masses too have a right to their traditional, i.e. regional and national thinking. One world, the concept, must not mean one homogeneous multicultural work. And I'm not saying that you promote that, but, well, it has a tendency. The one world has a tendency toward, well, some sort of homogeneous international person. And, well, homogeneous multicultural world is actually a contradiction in terms, because a cultural one world homogeneity is the opposite of pluralism and multiculturalism. I think we agree on that. We must not try to establish the new man. Multiculture often leads to low-level culture, or even monoculture. This must not be or this must not be the ultimate goal. The people of the world have a right for defining themselves firstly along national and regional borders and language lines. History has stopped all attempts to the contrary. Caesar, Mohammed, Napoleon, Hitler, Stalin, and the world communists. Nobody ever succeeded in imposing his own culture or ideology or superior ideology on the world. Nobody ever succeeded. Even that actually had been tried thousands of years ago already. So yes, to again quote from your website, cultural diplomacy is critical to fostering peace and stability throughout the world. I would agree, but the following, and this again is a quote, is probably a little bit too ambitious. Cultural diplomacy possesses the ability to influence the global public opinion of individuals, communities, cultures, or nations. I'm not saying it's wrong. This is actually what's happening today. But it is a very small reach, as I said. Soft power, and this is what I was just talking about, is important, but its exercitation always must be legitimized by democratic elections and the rule of law. The rule of law is the basis of our culture, possibly the only part really worth exporting. Soft power must not replace legitimate hard power. Legitimate hard law is not established through military force, and I've read that somewhere on your homepage, and I believe that hard power is not established through military force and the rule of the strongest, but through the will of the people, which means through votes, voluntary votes, free elections. So my plea is, soft power under no circumstances must lead to enforced policies against the voluntary will of the people as expressed in elections and elections only. One man, one woman, one vote is the basis not only for true democracy, but for Western civilization as a whole. Yves Leterme, in one of your discussions, I think it was last year, and I've seen the video, he said, I quote, "Many democratic ways lead to Rome. Democracy cannot be imported or exported, but just supported." A very wise sentence, and it's true. The will of the people can and will vary from culture to culture. Law and equality of all votes cast must always be at the center of our intercultural communication. So thank you, Mark Donfried and colleagues and ICD for inviting me here today. I appreciate your diplomatic listening. We all share the same goals like freedom, democracy, and peace. But regarding the path towards these goals, we need diplomatic discussions, soft in tone, but maybe we all have to carry a big stick. So thank you very much for your attention so far.